Ruth Shady was exhausted. Nearly 20 years researching archaeological sites in Peru, and nobody paid much attention to what she did. In 1994, she arrived at the Supe Valley, 200 kilometers north of Lima, following reports from peasants about strange mounds in the desert. When she saw those elevations, her heart must have raced, because those weren't mounds, they were pyramids, buried, forgotten, too ancient. The first carbon-14 dating came, back with a number that made her redo the test 3 times, 2627 before Christ, almost 5,000 years old. This placed that city in the same period as the pyramids of Giza. But wait, in Peru, in the Americas, this couldn't be right. The history everyone learned says the first American civilizations were the Olmecs in Mexico, around 1500 BC, but this was over 1,000 years older. Shady called colleagues, called international specialists, and all confirmed this was real. This was Caral. And Caral was the first known civilization of the Americas, older than the Incas by 4,000 years, older than the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Olmecs, older than everything. 6 main pyramids emerged from the desert when the team began excavating. The largest, named Pyramid Maya, was 18 meters high, with a colossal base of 150 by 160 meters. To give you dimension, 2 football fields fit inside. And it wasn't just size, it was engineering. The pyramids had steps, platforms, planned access ramps, circular sunken plazas in front like amphitheaters. And here comes the detail that left everyone confused. No ceramics, nothing. Not a piece of broken pot. Ceramics are a classic marker of sedentary civilization. You need them to store food, water, grains. But in Caral, 0. They used gourds, woven plant fiber baskets and cotton textiles. And it worked. There was also no writing, no pictograms, no complex symbols on walls, nothing suggesting formal recording of information. So how the hell did they organize a society of thousands of people? How did they plan massive constructions? How did they keep trade functioning? The answer must lie in social structure, because Caral wasn't an isolated city. It was the center of a network of 30 settlements scattered throughout the Supiest valley and surroundings, all interconnected, all exchanging resources. And to make this work without writing, you need systems based on trust, oral memory, shared rituals. But the most disturbing thing of all, no weapons. Shady excavated for years and didn't find a single spearhead, no clubs, no defensive walls, no skeletons with combat trauma, nothing suggesting war. And that's bizarre. Because all ancient civilizations have evidence of organized violence, all, except Caral. Were they really peaceful, or was violence so ritualized, so symbolic, that it left no physical trace? Or did they simply not have time to develop war before everything collapsed, because Caral didn't last forever? Around 1800 BC, after almost 1800 years of occupation, the city was abandoned. Completely. People disappeared. The pyramids remained empty. And for 5,000 years, no one remembered it existed, until Ruth Shady arrived, until she started digging and brought back the memory of a nameless people, of a civilization that flourished and disappeared without leaving direct descendants, without leaving legends, without leaving anything but stone. And when you look at those ruins today, the question that won't leave your mind is, why? What happened? Why did a society so advanced, so organized, simply stop existing? The secret of Caral begins with geography. The Supe Valley is an anomaly. In the middle of the Peruvian coastal desert, one of the most arid places on the planet, runs a river. The Supe River. It descends from the Andes, bringing fresh water and fertile sediments. And around this river, life explodes. While everything around is sand, stone, and death, the valley is green, humid, fertile. 5,000 years ago, this contrast was even more dramatic. The river was more voluminous, the rains in the mountains were more regular, and the valley produced food in abundance: cotton, squash, beans, sweet potato, cassava, pepper, peanuts, fruits like guava and lucuma. Everything grew there. But here comes the leap. Caral didn't survive on agriculture alone. The strategic location was the real trump card. The valley is only 23 kilometers from the Pacific Ocean, close enough for inhabitants to have direct access to marine resources: fish, mollusks, seaweed, anchovies in absurd quantity, brought by the cold Humboldt Current, and more. To the east, climbing the Andes, are the mountains with their mineral riches: obsidian, semi-precious stones, wood from high-altitude forests, and even further, the Amazon rainforest with its exotic bird feathers, medicinal plants, animals. Caral was in the middle, at the meeting point of three completely different ecosystems. This created an economy based on exchange. The people of Caral produced cotton in industrial quantity. It wasn't just any cotton. It was high-quality cotton, long fiber, perfect for making fishing nets. And the coastal fishermen needed those nets, so they traded. Cotton for dried fish for obsidian from the mountains, obsidian for macaw feathers from the jungle. There was no currency, no formal market, but it worked. And it worked so well that archaeologists found in Caral marine shells that only exist hundreds of kilometers away. They found wood from species that don't grow in the valley. They found evidence of Amazonian plants used in rituals. This means established trade routes, caravans, regular negotiations. And to make this happen without writing, without contracts, without a formal legal system, you need something more powerful than law. You need shared culture, rituals that create collective identity, faith in something greater than individual benefit. And that's where architecture comes in. Those pyramids weren't just to impress, they were social tools. Ceremonial centers where thousands of people gathered. And when you participate in a collective ritual, when you feel the vibration of drums, the sound of pututus echoing, when you see fire atop the pyramids, you feel part of something. You feel connected. Shady discovered that the circular sunken plazas had perfect acoustics, purposefully designed. Someone speaking in the center could be clearly heard throughout the entire extension, and when they played instruments, the sound reverberated, amplified, created a sensory experience that must have been overwhelming. They found flutes made from pelican and condor bones, marine shell trumpets called pututus that produce a deep, profound sound you feel in your chest. And when you play several of these instruments simultaneously in a plaza with planned acoustics, the effect is mystical, supernatural. They used music as social technology, as a form of control, perhaps, but also as a form of union, creating the sensation that everyone there was one people, one community. And this explains how they managed to coordinate massive projects without army, without police, without written bureaucracy. Faith moved mountains, literally, because building those pyramids required millions of hours of work. And apparently, people did this voluntarily, because they believed, because the priests said the gods wanted it, because participating in construction was participating in something sacred. But what happens when faith is no longer enough? When the gods stop responding? When harvests begin to fail? The size and construction technique used in Caral is fascinating. They had no metal tools, no bronze, no worked copper for cutting. So how did they move giant stone blocks? The answer is, they didn't. They invented something else. Shicra. That's the name of the technique. It works like this. You take plant fibers, weave resistant bags, fill these bags with medium-sized stones, tie them well, and use these bags as building blocks. Seems simple, and it is. But it's genius, because large stones are impossible to transport without advanced technology. But small stones inside bags? anyone can carry. Children, elderly, pregnant women, everyone can contribute. And when you have 3,000 people working together, each carrying one bag at a time, you build an 18-meter pyramid in a matter of years. Shady found thousands of these bags preserved inside the structures. And what's impressive is that many still had marks, different knots, specific weaving patterns, like signatures, as if each family, each group, made their own bags with a unique style. And then, when you place your bag in the pyramid, you're literally building the city with your own hands. You're part of the monument. This creates belonging, creates pride, and creates social control. Because if everyone contributed, everyone has interest in protecting, in maintaining, in respecting. The pyramids were built in stages, not all at once. Each generation added a new layer, expanded, reformed, and this means long-term planning, vision of the future. You don't build for yourself to see finished, but for your grandchildren, for your great-grandchildren. And there's another architectural detail that fascinates me, the circular sunken plazas. They're in front of the pyramids, in the center of the city. They're perfect. Amphitheaters. They descend 3-4 meters below ground level. They have stone benches around, capacity for hundreds of seated people. And the acoustics, as I said, are perfect. But it's not just that. The geometric arrangement is intentional. The plazas point in certain directions. Some align with the solstice, others with specific constellations. They were observing the sky, marking time, creating an astronomical calendar embedded in the city's very architecture. This isn't primitive. This is science, systematic observation, recording of patterns, and practical application. Because knowing when to plant, when to harvest, when to expect rains was a matter of survival. Shady also discovered that Caral had well-defined functional zones: residential area, ceremonial area, textile production area, storage area, everything separated, everything planned, like modern urban zoning. Elite houses were on the highest parts, had view of the entire city, were larger, better built, with internal courtyards. But they weren't palaces, didn't have absurd luxury. The difference was subtle. This suggests hierarchy, yes, but not extreme inequality. Common residences were smaller, simpler, but still well built. Adobe walls, woven cane roofs, packed earth floors, functional, adequate for the climate. And there was the work zone, where they found tools, looms, remains of textile production on an industrial scale, because Caral didn't produce cotton just for own use, produced for export, for trade, and this requires organization, quality control, logistics. There's evidence of specialized workshops, one place just for making fishing nets, another for processing fibers, another for fine weaving. Specialization means productivity, and productivity means surplus. And surplus is what allows sustaining a class that doesn't produce food: priests, administrators, artists, musicians. Because yes, Caral had professional musicians. The flutes found are complex, require skill to play, and the pututus, those giant shell trumpets, need lung power and technique. Not just anyone blows that and produces sound. You have to train, you have to practice. This means there were people whose function was to play music, and these people were sustained by the community. Because music was essential. It wasn't optional entertainment. It was social technology. It was how they maintained cohesion, how they reinforced rituals, how they controlled crowds. And the more you understand how Caral functioned, the more impressive it becomes. And the more disturbing the question becomes: how did all this crumble? No civilization lasts forever, but the collapse of Caral has unique characteristics. It wasn't invasion, it wasn't conquest, it wasn't plague. It was something slower, more insidious, more inevitable. Around 2000 BC, Caral was at its peak, estimated population between 3 and 5,000 inhabitants. The 30 cities of the network functioning in harmony, trade flowing, pyramids completed, regular rituals, everything right. But then, signs began to appear. Archaeology reveals hasty repairs in some structures. Walls reinforced with extra layers of adobe, pyramid bases widened, as if they were trying to protect buildings from something. From what? Earthquakes. Peru lies in the Pacific Ring of Fire. The Nazca Plate is being pushed beneath the South American plate. This generates constant seismic activity. Tremors are normal. Constructions were made taking this into account. Flexible structures, wide bases, materials that absorb impact. But around 1900 BC, something bigger happened. Much bigger. Geological evidence suggests a mega earthquake, estimated magnitude above 8 on the Richter scale, the type of earthquake that displaces rivers, that alters the course of underground currents, that changes the landscape. Shady found layers of chaotic sediments, sudden floods, violent floods that must have devastated plantations, destroyed irrigation canals, buried houses, and right after, these wet layers, there are layers of sand, desert sand advancing, the river changing course or weakening. Imagine you depending on that river for everything, for drinking, for irrigating, for sustaining 3,000 people. And suddenly, earthquake, crack in the earth. The river diverts, water decreases, plantations begin to dry. You try to adapt, dig new canals, try to redirect what's left of the river. But it doesn't work. Water doesn't reach anymore. And without water, no agriculture. And without agriculture, no food. And without food, no city. And worse, without harvest, you don't have what to trade. And Caral's economy was based on trade, cotton for fish. But if you don't produce cotton, coastal fishermen stop bringing fish. And if there's no fish, you have no protein. And hunger tightens. The other settlements of the network begin to feel the same, because everyone depended on the Supe Valley for something. And when the center collapses, the entire network destabilizes. It's domino effect. There's evidence they tried to resist. Intensified local fishing, changed planting areas to zones closer to what remained of the river, tried to economize resources, reduce ceremonies, fewer festivals, fewer rituals, focus on survival. But this has a social cost, because those ceremonies were the glue that kept everything together. They were the moment where everyone felt part of the collective. And when you reduce this, when rituals stop, people begin to question, begin to ask, where are the gods? Why aren't they helping us? And the priests, who derived authority from their connection with the divine, begin to lose credibility. If they speak with the gods, why did the gods allow this? Why is the land drying? Why are children dying of hunger? The power structure in Caral was based on religious consensus. There was no army, no police, no brute force to impose obedience. It was faith. It was shared belief. And when this belief wavers, the system crumbles. Families began to leave. First the youngest, those who had mobility. They took what they could carry and went looking for another place, another valley, another river. And who stayed? The old, the sick, those who had too much faith to abandon, those who believed the gods would still return. But the gods didn't return, and around 1800 BC, Caral was practically empty. A few dozen people maybe, taking care of the ruins, performing desperate rituals, begging for rain, for water, for salvation. And then even these people left or died, and Caral became silence. What happens when a city dies? Not when it's destroyed in war, not when it's burned, but when it's simply abandoned. When people leave and never return, the pyramids remained, solid, imposing, but empty. The plazas where thousands gathered became nests of wind. Sand began to invade, slow, persistent, covering steps, filling rooms, burying memories. Years passed, decades, centuries, and Caral was being forgotten. Other cultures arose in Peru. Chavin, around 900 BC, with their elaborate temples and feline iconography. Moche, with their adobe pyramids. And realistic ceramics. Nazca, with their giant lines in the desert. Huari, Chimu, and finally, the Incas. But none of these cultures had memory of Caral, no legend, no origin myth speaking of an ancient city in the Supe Valley. It's as if Caral never existed, and that's bizarre, because generally, civilizations leave cultural marks, stories passed from generation to generation. But Caral? Erased completely. Why? Perhaps because survivors dispersed so much that memory fragmented. Perhaps because lack of writing meant there was no permanent record. Perhaps because the trauma of collapse was so great that people preferred to forget. Start from zero, not look back. Or perhaps it was divine punishment in their view. Perhaps they believed Caral was cursed, that the gods rejected it, and therefore no one spoke about it. It was taboo. It was shame. Whatever the reason, the result was the same. 5,000 years of silence, 5,000 years buried under sand, while the world continued, while empires rose and fell, while Europeans arrived, conquered, colonized. Caral slept. Until in 1905, a German archaeologist named Max Uhle passed through the Supe Valley and mentioned in his notes artificial mounds, but didn't pay attention, thought they were natural formations, or perhaps recent constructions. Nothing special. In 1975, another archaeologist, Carlos Williams, visited the site and suggested it could be something ancient, but didn't have funding to excavate, filed the idea. And then, in 1994, Ruth Shady arrived, with few resources, with a small team, with giant determination, and began to dig, and didn't stop anymore. The first years were hard. Peruvian government didn't invest. International Academy was skeptical. It can't be that old, they said. They must have made a mistake in dating, they insisted. But Shady continued, redid tests, brought specialists, accumulated evidence, until in 2001 the scientific community finally accepted Caral was real and it was revolutionary. In 2009, UNESCO declared Caral as World Heritage, official recognition, but also responsibility, because now you had to preserve, protect, study, and then modern problems began. Caral is in rural area, poor, with little infrastructure, and some of the surrounding lands are private property, farmers, people who plant corn, squash, raise goats, and these people sometimes don't understand why they can't use certain area. They're just old stones, they say. There's also the problem of looters, huaqueros, as they're called in Peru. People who invade archaeological sites at night, dig, steal artifacts and sell on black market. Shady and her team have caught several cases, have lost priceless pieces. And there's the funding issue. Excavations are expensive, preservation even more so. Peruvian government helps, but it's never enough. International organizations contribute, but with bureaucracy. And meanwhile, sand continues advancing, wind continues eroding, time continues corroding. Shady is now 77 years old, has spent more than 30 years of her life excavating Caral. And there's still so much to discover. It's estimated that only 10% of the site has been excavated, 90% continues buried, waiting, and she knows she won't see everything, that she'll die before Caral reveals all its secrets, but continues, because someone has to do it. Someone has to give voice to this nameless people. Someone has to ensure Caral isn't forgotten again. Let's talk about what Caral doesn't have, because sometimes what's missing is as important as what exists, and the absences in Caral are glaring. First, Weapons. I already mentioned this, but it needs to be emphasized. In 30 years of systematic excavation, in tens of thousands of catalogued artifacts, they haven't found a single offensive weapon. No stone spearheads, no petrified wood clubs, no slings, no bows, nothing. Compare this with any other ancient civilization. In Mesopotamia, they find entire arsenals. In Egypt, soldier mummies, with weapons buried alongside. In China, terracotta armies. In Mesoamerica, obsidian clubs, atlatls for throwing. War was universal, except in Caral. Second, fortifications. The pyramids have no defensive function. They're not fortresses. They don't have protective walls around, no moats, no watchtowers. The city is completely open, vulnerable, as if they didn't expect to be attacked, or as if they had no enemies. Third, evidence of interpersonal violence. The skeletons found, about 60 so far, don't show trauma consistent with combat. No one died with crushed skull. No one has arrow marks. No one was decapitated. People died of old age, disease, occasional accidents, but not war. This is disturbing because it challenges everything we know about human nature. Conflict over resources is natural. Competition for status is natural. Ritualized violence, at least, was expected. But there isn't. Nothing. Shady argues that Caral had an economic system that made war unnecessary. The trade network was so beneficial for all involved that cooperation was more advantageous than conflict. If you attack coastal fishermen, they stop supplying you with fish, and you die of hunger, so you don't attack. Simple. But is it that simple? Other archaeologists are skeptical. They argue that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Perhaps weapons were made of organic materials that didn't survive. Perhaps conflicts were ritualized in non-lethal form. Perhaps we just haven't found them yet. Fourth, writing. Nothing. No proto-writing. No pictograms. The only markings are decorative patterns on textiles and baskets, nothing suggesting abstract communication of ideas. So how did they pass technical knowledge? How did they record commercial transactions? How did they maintain religious calendars? The answer has to be oral memory, oral tradition, and objects as mnemonics, perhaps a primitive type of quipu, those knotted strings that Incas used to record information. But so far, they haven't found any. Fifth, ceramics. 0. And that's strange because ceramics are a relatively simple technology. Clay, fire, done. And it's extremely useful. Storage, cooking, transport of liquids. But Caral people didn't make it. They used gourds, baskets waterproofed with resins, textiles. Did they not know how? Unlikely. Was it cultural choice? Perhaps. Perhaps ceramics were associated with other cultures, and they deliberately avoided them to maintain distinct identity. Sixth, individual monuments, no statues of leaders, no elaborate tombs, no inscriptions glorifying kings. Everything is collective. The pyramids belong to the community. The plazas belong to the community. There's no cult of personality. This suggests a power structure very different from what we see in other ancient civilizations. Less centralized, less autocratic, more distributed. Seventh, metals. Nothing. No worked copper, no gold, no silver, only stone, bone, plant fibers, wood. Pure Neolithic technology. These absences paint a fascinating picture. Caral was sophisticated in certain aspects, monumental architecture, urban planning, long-distance trade, astronomy, but primitive in others, material technology, information recording, metallurgy. It's as if they had developed certain areas of civilization, but not others. As if they had followed a completely different evolutionary path from the rest of the world. And it worked. For almost 2,000 years, it worked, until it stopped working. When it was discovered that Caral was 5,000 years old, many People questioned, how do we know it's really a civilization? Because to be considered civilization, you need to meet certain criteria, and Caral challenges several of them. Criterion 1, cities. Caral qualifies. Clearly urbanized, spatial planning, functional zones, dense population, check. Criterion 2, monumental architecture, double check. 6 giant pyramids, elaborate ceremonial plazas, amphitheaters, public buildings. Criterion 3, social stratification, check. Clear difference between elite residences and common residences. Division of labor, professional specialization. Criterion 4, long-distance trade. Check. Commercial networks extending hundreds of kilometers. But then come the problematic ones. Criterion 5, writing, missing. Criterion 6, metallurgy, missing. Criterion 7, ceramics, missing. So is Caral, or isn't it a civilization? The standard answer today is yes, but we need to expand our definition of civilization, because Caral proves you can have massive social complexity without certain markers we considered essential. And this is important, because it means civilization doesn't have a single recipe, doesn't have a unique path. Different cultures can develop different solutions to the same problems. For example, without ceramics, how do you store water? Caral used giant gourds, waterproofed with natural resins, worked perfectly. Without writing, how do you keep records? Collective memory, repetitive rituals that reinforce information, songs that carry agricultural calendars, ultra-structured oral tradition. Without metal, how do you cut stone? You don't cut, you use small stones in bags, or you carve with harder stone tools, obsidian, quartz. Each problem had a solution, and these solutions were adequate to the environment, to the climate, to available resources, and to the culture's value system, because, and this is crucial, technology isn't neutral. Technology reflects values. If Caral didn't develop weapons, perhaps it's because violence wasn't valued. If it didn't develop writing, perhaps it's because oral transparency was more important than permanent record. Anthropologists call this equifinality. Different paths to the same result. Caral reached civilizational complexity by a different route from Mesopotamia, different from Egypt, different from China, but it arrived. And this diversity is beautiful, shows that humanity is creative, adaptable. There's no single way to be civilized, but it also raises questions about fragility, because each system has specific vulnerabilities. Mesopotamia, dependent on large rivers, collapsed when those rivers changed. Egypt, dependent on the Nile's annual flood, suffered when the cycle failed. Caral, dependent on the Supe River and its trade network, crumbled when both failed. There's no perfect system, no invulnerable civilization, and perhaps that's Caral's most important lesson. It doesn't matter how sophisticated you are, it doesn't matter how well organized, if the environmental conditions that sustain your system change drastically, you collapse. And this resonates today. Because we live in a complex global system, interdependent, based on delicate balances, stable climate, supply chains functioning, international trade flowing, and when something breaks, pandemic, war, climate change, we see how fragile everything is. Caral teaches us humility, reminds us that civilization is achievement, yes, but also fragility. It's pride, but also vulnerability. It's power, but also dependence. And perhaps that's why Caral was forgotten, because its message is uncomfortable. It's easier to celebrate empires that lasted 1,000 years than to remember civilizations that collapsed. It's easier to build narratives of linear progress than to accept that civilization is cyclical. Born, grows, decays, dies, but the uncomfortable truth is that all civilizations die. Eventually, Rome died, Byzantium died, the Mayans died, the Incas died, and ours will die too. One day. Could be in 100 years, could be in 1,000, but it will. And when archaeologists of the future excavate our ruins, what will they find? What will they think? Will they understand why we collapsed? Or will they be as confused as we are with Caral? Ruth Shady doesn't work alone. She has a team, and this team spends months, sometimes years, excavating a single building. Because archaeology isn't digging fast. It's digging slowly, meticulously, recording each layer, each object, each change of coloration in the soil. One of the most fascinating buildings they excavated is called the Amphitheater Temple. It's in the center of Caral, and it has unique characteristics. A monumental staircase rises up the entire front face. They're wide steps designed to climb in groups, in procession. It's not for one person, it's for hundreds. At the top, there's a platform, and on this platform they found something disturbing, a circular altar with remains of offerings, animal bones, burned seeds, marine shells, and something more. Human bones, not many. 3 individuals, 1 adult, 2 children. Was it human sacrifice? Shady is cautious, says there's no conclusive evidence. The bones could be from burials, could have been placed there after death, not necessarily killed as offering, but other archaeologists are less optimistic. They point out that human sacrifice was common in later Andean cultures. Incas did it, Moche did it, Chavin probably did it. Why would Caral be exception? And if you think rationally in times of crisis, drought, famine, desperation, human sacrifice makes horrible sense. If the gods are angry, you need to appease them. And the most valuable offering is human life, especially children, pure, innocent. This doesn't mean it was uncommon, could have been rare, exceptional, last resort, but it could have happened. And this changes the romantic narrative of Caral as peaceful paradise. Because even without war, there could have been ritualistic violence, could have had control through fear, could have had religious coercion. The truth is probably more nuanced. Societies are complex. They're not completely good or completely bad. They're human. With all the contradictions, that implies another fascinating building is the main pyramid building, 18 meters high, and when they excavated the base, they found something unexpected. Funerary chambers, not rich, not with treasures, but carefully built. Inside, skeletons in fetal position, wrapped in cotton textiles, with simple offerings, some bone flutes, shell necklaces, nothing extravagant, but the care is evident. They respected their dead. And this is consistent. Throughout Caral, the dead are treated with dignity, not thrown, not forgotten, buried with intention, with ritual. This says something about values, about how they viewed death. Perhaps they believed in afterlife. Perhaps they thought ancestors continued present, protecting, watching. They also found foundation burials, offerings placed under buildings when construction began, usually seeds, fruits, sometimes a small animal. It was request for blessing, request for protection, so the building would be stable, prosperous, lasting, and it usually worked. Caral's structures are solid, survived 5,000 years, earthquakes, floods, winds, and they're still standing. This is testimony to extraordinary engineering, but it also raises a question. If they knew how to build so well, why didn't they rebuild after the collapse? Why didn't they return? The answer might be psychological, collective trauma. When you lose everything, when you see your city die, when your gods seem to abandon you, maybe you don't want to return. Maybe the place becomes cursed in your mind. Maybe it's better to start from zero somewhere else. Forget, move forward, and that's what seems to have happened. Caral's survivors dispersed. Some went north, founded new settlements in the Fortaleza Valley. Others went south, to the Huaura Valley. Others climbed to the Andes, became llama and alpaca herders, and over generations, the memory of Caral diluted, became vague legend, then not even that, became complete oblivion. Until in 2023, archaeologists discovered Penico, a city 40 kilometers from Caral, dating from 1500 BC, with similar architecture, circular plazas, shicra pyramids, same techniques. Were they Caral refugees? Did they try to rebuild? Research is still ongoing, but if true, it means Caral's spirit survived, that the culture didn't die completely, just migrated, adapted, persisted. There's a profound philosophical question in Caral. What defines civilizational success? Duration, military power, cultural legacy, technological advancement. If duration is the criterion, Caral failed. 2,000 years seems like a lot, but Rome lasted 1,000 and is still remembered. Egypt lasted 3,000 and still dominates popular imagination. China exists for 5,000 years, uninterrupted. If military power is the criterion, Caral doesn't qualify. Didn't conquer territories, didn't subjugate peoples, didn't expand through force. If cultural legacy is the criterion, Caral also fails. Didn't influence later civilizations, didn't leave direct cultural descendants, didn't create recognizable artistic tradition. If technology is the criterion, Caral falls behind, didn't invent writing, didn't develop metallurgy, didn't advance weaponry. But are these the right criteria? Can't success be measured another way? What if success is quality of life? Caral had no war. This means fewer violent deaths, less suffering, more peace. What if success is sustainability? Caral lived in harmony with environment for 2,000 years, didn't deforest, didn't pollute, didn't exhaust resources. Only collapsed when external factors, earthquake, climate change, made the region uninhabitable. What if success is cooperation? Caral created trade network based on mutual trust, 30 cities working together without military coercion. That's achievement. What if success is art? Caral had music, had beautiful textiles, had monumental architecture that still impresses. That's legacy. Perhaps we need to rethink how we evaluate ancient civilizations, because traditional narrative privileges military empires, conquerors, generals, kings. But are these the only stories that matter? Caral tells another story of people who chose trade over conquest, who chose ritual over army, who chose music over weapons, and it worked. For 2,000 years, of course it ended badly, of course they didn't survive. But so what? All civilizations end. What matters is what they do while they exist. And Caral existed admirably, built beauty, created harmony, lived in relative peace. And when the end came, it wasn't because they failed morally. It was because the earth literally betrayed them. This isn't failure, this is tragedy. And there's crucial difference. Failure implies responsibility, implies they could have done differently. But what could Caral have done against mega earthquake, against river course change, against catastrophic drought? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. Even with modern technology, we struggle against natural disasters. Imagine with Neolithic technology. So, judging Caral by collapse is unfair. It's looking at the end and forgetting the 2,000 years of life. It's defining civilization by death instead of by life. And when you invert the perspective, Caral becomes inspiration, becomes proof that it's possible to build complex society without systemic violence, that it's possible to organize thousands of people through shared culture instead of fear. Of course, it wasn't utopia, had hierarchy, had inequality, perhaps had occasional human sacrifice, but compared to other ancient civilizations, Caral shines. Didn't have mass slavery like Egypt, didn't have constant war like Mesopotamia, didn't have ritualistic cannibalism like some later Mesoamerican cultures. Caral was, within the context of the time, relatively benign. And this matters because it shows violence isn't inevitable, that war isn't the only way to organize society, that it's possible to choose another path. Caral chose and paid price, Because peaceful societies are vulnerable, don't have defenses, don't have military resilience. When crisis comes, they suffer disproportionately. But at least they tried. At least they proved alternative exists. And they left this proof in stone, in pyramids that are still standing, in plazas that still echo silently. And perhaps that's Caral's true legacy. Not architecture, not trade, but possibility. Possibility that humanity can choose peace, can choose cooperation, can build civilization without blood. They did it for 2,000 years. And if they did it once, can do it again, can do it better, can make it last. That's Caral's message. Not of failure, but of hope. Here we are, at the end of Caral's story, or rather at the end of what we know, because Caral still has secrets. 90% of the site continues buried, waiting. Ruth Shady is now 77 years old, has dedicated more than 30 years excavating, more than 30 years fighting for funding, more than 30 years defending Caral against skeptics, looters, bureaucracy. And she continues, every day, supervising excavations, training new archaeologists, protecting the legacy. She knows she won't see everything, that she'll die before Caral reveals all its stories. But it doesn't matter, because she's done enough, brought Caral back to the world, gave voice to a civilization silenced for 5,000 years, and now thousands visit annually. Tourists, students, researchers, all walking through the same plazas where Caral people walked, looking at the same pyramids, feeling the same desert wind. And when you're there, it's impossible not to feel the weight of time, feel the ghostly presence of people who lived, loved, worked, died there, nameless people, but not without importance, because they mattered. They changed history, proved that civilization in the Americas didn't begin with Olmecs, began 2,000 years earlier, in Forgotten Valley, with forgotten people. And now we know. Now we remember, and that has immense value. But there's also a question that haunts me. If Caral could be forgotten for 5,000 years, what else has been forgotten? How many other civilizations disappeared without leaving obvious trace? How many other stories are buried, waiting for someone to find them? Probably many, because archaeology is limited. We excavate less than 1% of what exists, and we concentrate on known areas. Obvious. But what about remote areas, isolated valleys, forgotten islands? How many Carals still sleep under desert, under jungle, under sea, waiting for someone with Ruth Shady's patience to discover them? The answer is, we don't know, and we'll never know completely, because time is merciless, destroys evidence, erases memories, and no matter how much we excavate, there will always be more lost than found. But this doesn't mean we should stop. On the contrary, it means we should value even more what we find. Each discovery is miracle. Each artifact is message across millennia. Each lost city recovered is victory against oblivion. And Caral is monumental victory, not just archaeological, but moral. Because Caral teaches us humility, reminds us we don't know everything, that history is bigger than we thought, that humanity is more diverse, more creative, more resilient than we imagined. So, what do you take from this story? What stays in your head when you think about Caral? Leave in comments. Seriously, which part marked you most? Was it the absence of war, the environmental collapse, the impossible architecture, or just the fact they were completely forgotten? For me, what remains is the image of that last person leaving, turning their back to the pyramids, looking at the desert ahead and walking, not knowing they were closing a chapter, not knowing 5,000 years would pass before someone remembered. But there's also hope, because if Caral could exist, if it could prosper without war, if it could create beauty and harmony for 2,000 years, then it's possible. It's possible to build better society. It's possible to choose peace. It's possible to last. Maybe not forever, Nothing lasts forever, but for long enough to matter, for long enough to leave mark, for long enough that, even if forgotten, someone one day finds us, excavates us, remembers us. That's all we can ask, to be remembered, to be recognized, to have mattered. And Caral mattered. 5,000 years later, still matters, still teaches, still inspires. So if you made it this far, thank you. Thank you for remembering together. Thank you for paying attention to nameless people, to civilization without writing, to city that disappeared but didn't die, because as long as we remember, Caral still lives, in our questions, in our reflections, in our search to understand where we came from. If you enjoyed this, share this video, send to someone who likes archaeological mysteries, and subscribe to the channel, because there's much more lost history waiting to be told. Caral waits, in the Peruvian desert, under the scorching sun, guarding its secrets, waiting for us to keep digging, keep asking, keep remembering, and we will, because this story isn't finished, it's only begun.